This talk that I will do today, it relates to a book project of mine that has been years and years in writing. I used to do them a lot faster than now. Now I'm just stuck. I get bogged down in documents. There's something else as well. I used to be, I used to sort of take a what you might call very simplistically von Rankian approach. You take a pile of documents, you read them, you think, oh, wow, that's a great story. Let me tell the story here on the basis of this document. and now I don't do this anymore. I still like to tell stories, but I'm trying as well to see a bigger picture and to understand how history actually works. And that's part of, I think, my myself coming to terms with who I am as a historian, maybe becoming a little bit more mature in my writing. The problem then, of course, is that writing takes so much longer because I keep coming back to it and coming back to it, and I'm really trying to figure it out. So this talk here is part of this figuring out process. I have to say that my book is nearly finished. I've been writing it for 10 years. It's been nearly finished for at least 5 years, frankly. So it might as well take another 10 years to write, who knows. But the book is on, it's a history of the Cold War. It goes beyond the Cold War. It's really a history of the Cold War and what happened afterwards. I see a lot of continuities between the Cold War and after Cold War. In this regard, I'm somewhat different from the majority of Cold War historians who see the Cold War as something unique and very special. What I will focus on today, however, is the early part of the Cold War, the origins of the Cold War as they appear to me and as they appear from the Soviet side. And when I talk about the origins of the Cold War, I would like first and foremost to discuss Soviet grand strategy. Grand strategy is a popular word these days. People like to talk about grand strategy. Might as well just discuss the Soviet grand strategy, whatever it was or wasn't. Now, when we ask ourselves this question, what was the Soviet grand strategy? It seems that it's almost impossible to escape some sort of reliance or fallback on the question of ideology and question of Marxism, Leninism. And this is how it seemed to American policymakers at the early stages of the Cold War and really throughout the Cold War. There was something about the Soviet Union. There was this ideological power that was trying to spread world revolution, was doing it by imperialist aims, as my good friend and colleague Vlad Zubok and Konstantin Pleshakov wrote in a very well-known book. The Soviets had an revolutionary imperial paradigm. So they combined kind of imperial impulse with revolutionary messianic urge to turn the world communist. So this presumably was the grand strategy. And if you put it in those terms, it almost starts to make sense. I was looking at some foundational documents of US foreign policy from the early Cold War years. And one that, of course, everybody likes to talk about is in addition to George Kennan's long telegram, which is a must mention for any account of the Cold War. The other is NSC 68, which was approved in April 1950, and presented a pretty dark view, as you probably know, of what the drafters of NSC 68 called fundamental Soviet design, or the fundamental design of the Kremlin. This is what it's called in the document. I've got the document here, actually. It says, the fundamental design of those who control the Soviet Union and the international communist movement is to retain and solidify their absolute power, first in the Soviet Union and second in the areas now under their control. In the minds of the Soviet leaders, however, achievement of this design requires the dynamic extension of their authority and the ultimate elimination of any effective opposition to their authority. It's a very dark view. power, you want to control, you want to extend it, until you basically control the entire world. The United States is the only thing that stands between you and world domination. This is the view that was presented of Soviet intentions and Soviet grand strategy from early Cold War. And I don't think it really changed all that much in the historiography. We still kind of see it in those terms, although now there's increasing tendency, and I will talk a little bit about this, to regard the Soviets as less expansionism driven and more concerned about their security. So, do I challenge this interpretation? I would say yes. My starting point for challenging this interpretation is to ask, what were the actual ends of Soviet foreign policy? What did they want to accomplish? What did Moscow want in the world? And to conceptualize this, there were various ways to talk about it. One that struck me as an interesting approach is to draw a kind of a Maslow pyramid. If you know what I'm talking about, this pyramid where you have usually used by psychologists to describe the people's basic needs as line at the bottom of the pyramid. So physical security, food, house, those you would think that those are basic needs. And then building on that, you would have other things that contribute to well-being, self-esteem, recognition, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I would contend that you could picture Soviet foreign policy in much the same way. So it's a pyramidal structure, a pyramid. At the bottom of this pyramid lies the need for security of the state, security of the ruling elites who run the state. Building up from that at the second level to the top, you've got something like striving for recognition. And this issue of recognition is very interesting and very important. We don't talk enough about it among historians. Political scientists have done that. There's a lot of talk of recognition in political science. Including with regard to Russia or China and other so-called prestige seekers. You could probably apply the same model to the United States. Francis Fukuyama likes to talk about recognition in his various books, including his very recent book, Identity, but he doesn't apply to states. He mainly talks about individuals and their striving for recognition, their desire to be recognized. Well, the Soviets also wanted to be recognized. They wanted to have this prestige, status, etc. So I'll get to that in a second. Let me first pedal back here for a second to security, because security is often misunderstood. There are two types of security. First, you can actually, you may want to physically control territory. And if you think about Stalin and the early post-war years, post-World War II years, it almost like you would want to understand security precisely in those terms, because Stalin understood security as a buffer. He wanted that space to prevent invading armies from reaching Moscow. The more territory you have in this regard, the better. The more territory you control, the better. So this is kind of physical security. This would almost lead you to think that Stalin was quite, as and the NSC 68 put it, was just absolutely determined to control any piece of territory that he laid his hands on. However, when you investigate the documents of the early Cold War period, which you find out, and historians, I think, would by and large agree to that, is that this is not at all the case. One book that comes to mind that recently came out with actually a very similar argument is Norman Naimark, where he argues that Stalin had a very different approach to different Eastern European countries. He looks at countries from Finland in the north to Austria and says, well, look, the approaches were different. What Stalin did in Poland or Germany was very different from what he did in Austria or Finland. So you say that, the Soviets were always expansion driven. How come they controlled Finland? How come they did not actually impose communism on Finland? They, by and large, controlled Austria. In 1945, how come they did not try to impose themselves on Austria, or at least force some sort of division of it into spheres of influence? Of course, you know that eventually a treaty was signed and the Soviets essentially left Austria, not to its own devices, but by and large, Austria, Austria, of course, was not communized like Czechoslovakia or something like that. So as you see, there are different approaches that Stalin took that historians have now been able to figure out. And the question is why? And the answer hinges on the question of legitimacy. I'll talk about legitimacy in a second, but let me just actually follow up from that idea that Norman Naimark put out in his book. That Stalin had a very different approach depending on the case that we're dealing with. Indeed, Naimark did not only dealt with Europe, but if you look to Asia, this is precisely what you see in Stalin's approach to different Asian theaters. So he had one policy, for example, he could actually annex territory. This was not above Stalin. He would actually annex territory all the time. So in Asia, the case that comes to mind is, of course, Tuva. Tuva was annexed by the Soviet Union and became integrated into the Soviet proper and still part of Russia today, right? Annexation of Tuva. Here's a case of Mongolia. Right next to Tuva, you have Mongolia. The Soviets basically controlled Mongolia. For all intents and purposes, Mongolia was Soviet satellite. The Soviets exported the revolutionary purchase there, and bloodbath was very much Soviet instigated, and the Soviets could actually remove Mongolian prime ministers at will and execute them, as they did several times. So Mongolia was a Soviet satellite, but interestingly enough, Stalin did not actually annex Mongolia, not for lack of trying on the part of the Mongolians, because several Mongolian politicians, not least Yumshagin Tsedenbal, who became the leader of Mongolia after Chobolsan's death, actually put forward this idea, saying, please, we want to be part of the USSR. The Soviets said no. So this was interesting. You did not have to actually annex a territory to control it. So in Tuva, he annexed the territory. In Mongolia, he just wanted to cut it out from China, which still claimed Mongolia as its own, but stop far of annexing the territory. Or you could have a situation like in Xinjiang. In Xinjiang in the 1940s, Stalin pursued a policy of supporting ethnic separatism, which he also did, by the way, in northern Iran. So there's actually quite very similar parallel between what Stalin was doing in Iran and what Stalin was doing in Xinjiang, as well-known Azeri historian Jamil Hassan Lee has shown in his two excellent books on the subject. So in Xinjiang, Stalin was basically not just supporting Uyghurs politically, but also economically and militarily. Not just militarily, but the Soviets were actually fighting on the ground. There were actually Soviet troops in Xinjiang fighting against the Chinese, right? So, and with their help, the Uyghur separatists were able to establish de facto independence by the summer of 1945. They were on their way to capturing Xinjiang. They could have done it if Stalin really wanted to. Now, interestingly, those Uyghur separatists were not communists by any stretch of imagination, and Stalin didn't really mind that. He still controlled the whole movement. He did not mind that they were not communists. So whereas in Mongolia, they were communists, in Xinjiang, Stalin could actually exercise effective control over territory without annexing and without making it communist. So it's another type of control. By the same token, Stalin exercised some control, not full control, over Mao Zedong's communist movement in China, in the sense that he had a kind of ideological link to Mao. So he could order, as a communist would order a communist. You have to do that. And Mao Zedong was expected to follow the Comintern's instructions, while Comintern still existed, and after even the Comintern fell apart, or rather not, but was folded by Stalin by 1943. After that, Mao Zedong was still expected to follow Stalin's instructions. So the Soviets did not actually control Yan'an or the communist areas. Those were under Chinese communist control, but they exercised ideological influence, ideological authority. So you can see the variety of types of control that Stalin could exercise for his purposes of security. So it's not just absolutely physical control. You have to be in control of a territory. There are actually grades and shades and varieties, and this kind of nuance is lost when we talk about Soviet expansionism as driven by security concerns. Yeah, it's totally lost. It's totally obscured because we do not take into account those cases. Once we take those cases into account, we see the sheer complexity of the whole picture of how the Cold War unfolded in its early years. Now, the Asian case is actually quite interesting for another reason. And I previously mentioned that issue of legitimacy. Legitimacy is hugely important for Stalin. It's one thing to control a territory, and it is another thing, and much more important thing, to have this control recognized by the powers that be. And who are the powers that be? Well, it's the United States, because Stalin sees that as the other great power out there. After 1945, up to 1945, also he had the same kind of idea with regard to Great Britain. Often, Stalin was willing to moderate his push for gains, although he could have grabbed particular territory. He was willing to moderate his appetites in return for American recognition of the things that he already had. The prime example is his approach to China. As we know, during the Yalta Conference in February 1945, certain things were agreed between Stalin and Roosevelt in relation to China. Chiang Kai-shek was, of course, outraged that he was cut out of the deal, but he was forced to acknowledge and respect that deal struck at Yalta. Therefore, he sent his prime minister to Moscow to negotiate the Sino-Soviet Treaty of Alliance, which was signed in August 1945, and gave Stalin certain things in China, the most important of which was Mongolia's independence. China acknowledged Mongolia's independence. That was hugely important to Stalin. He really pushed TV Sung or Sun Tzu. He really pushed him on that issue. Chiang Kai-shek ultimately had to agree. And the Soviets also got some bases. They got the railroad, which they had previously sold to the Japanese in Manchukuo. They got it back. Then what else did he get? He got the naval base in Port Arthur or Dalian, close to Dalian. So there were some very, very nice gains. And what made those gains especially sweet for Stalin, was that basically the Americans recognized them, right? In the Yalta framework. It was all part of the Yalta agreement, all part of the Yalta framework, broadly speaking. Now, Stalin also made concessions. So he sold out the Xinjiang Uyghur separatist movement and basically allowed the Chinese to recapture control there. In a matter of a few years, the leaders of this movement were taken for negotiations to the Soviet Union, and their airplane crashed, which is how Stalin resolved those issues. Then he also ordered Mao. He promised Chiang Kai-shek, said, I will not support Mao's communist. Of course, for Chiang, this was the key issue. This was why he agreed to Mongolia's independence, because because Stalin promised not to support Mao. Did he carry this out? Yes, he did. If you look at how what Stalin communicated to Mao, first of all, in August 1945, he sends a cable to Mao Zedong telling him to do what? Go to Chongqing. Mao was outraged. Go to Chongqing, how? They'll shoot me down. That's why he got the US ambassador to come down to Yan'an and follow on the same plane with him, because he was afraid that the Chiang Kai-shek's forces would shoot him down. Go to Chongqing. Why? To negotiate coalition government with the Republic of China. So basically, Stalin was selling out Mao Zedong. And later on, in Manchuria and in other areas of China, Stalin seemed he was quite frustrated that the communists were trying to capture control. I mean, his position changed eventually, as we know, and eventually he began to support the Chinese communists more and more, until finally he put all of his eggs in that basket. But it didn't really happen until practically after well, in some ways, it started happening already as the Soviet forces withdrew from Manchuria in 1946, but really didn't happen until 1947 and beyond. So Stalin remained very cautious with regard to Mao. Mao thought that this is because Stalin did not believe in in the prospect of Chinese Communist Revolution, and he was probably right. But who could believe in the prospect of Chinese Communist Revolution anyway? It was so unlikely at that point. So you can say that Stalin was unduly suspicious in this regard. So what I'm saying here is Stalin was willing to have moderate gains, not control everything, in return for American and other, international recognition of the gains that he already had. So it's interesting, isn't it? Psychologically interesting, because security then becomes not something just absolutely connected to physical control. It also becomes something that can be negotiated with your potential adversary. Okay. So the next thing, we've worked out the base of the pyramid. The next level of the pyramid is this question of recognition, status, prestige, something like that. This is where it becomes extremely interesting, because you can say, oh, you know, the Soviets wanted recognition. But the question to ask about is, okay, recognition as what? Recognition by who exactly? What exactly is that supposed to mean? There are two types of recognition that mattered for the Soviets. The first was to be recognized as the leader of the communist world, or the revolutionary world. And here Stalin expected complete deference. So when we talk about the creation of the socialist camp, and members of those socialist camp were expected, where they had to defer to Stalin. If they didn't, then guess what happened? They would be expelled from the communist movement, as of course Tito found out to his chagrin, when this is precisely what happened to him, and he was vilified in the Soviet Union. And of course, Stalin wanted to get him killed, but didn't have a chance. Rather, he would have a chance, but he died before he managed to do that. So here we're talking about recognition by your clients. You are in charge of this clientele. They have to recognize you as the leader, as the great authority, right? This is one form of recognition. The other form of recognition is recognition of you, I mean the Soviet Union, as a great power and co-equal with the United States. And guess who can recognize, who can award this kind of recognition? Obviously, the United States has to award this recognition as the other great power, or the other superpower. Now, these are two different types of recognition, but they are mutually reinforcing. So, for example, if you are being recognized by the United States as a great power, as a superpower, then you will thereby make yourself more attractive to your clients, because they will defer to you. They'll think, oh, the Americans recognize them as the great power, therefore, they are. This is how those relationships work, right? And also from the perspective of the United States, if you have clients, and if you are this, great power that is at the top of its own hierarchy, then of course you become all the greater. And you can be recognized as a co-equal with the United States. So much for recognition so far. So I've been talking about this recognition, security, recognition, some kind of psychological pyramids that we're trying to construct here. And I've spent I've already spent half an hour talking about this, almost half an hour. And I have not even managed to say much about ideology so far, which is kind of interesting, because usually this is the starting point for any discussion of the Cold War. So it begs a question. This framework that I'm proposing here, does it even have anything to do with ideology? And my answer to this is that it doesn't really depend on ideology. It's kind of ideology neutral. You can have any ideology there. It doesn't have to be Marxism, Leninism. You can fill it with anything you want. But this fundamental psychological pyramid will still remain there. Psychological pyramid is important for legitimation of the ruling elites. Legitimation is something that is necessary under all circumstances. Ideologies come and go, but legitimation stays and remains. You cannot do without legitimation. And this kind of psychological pyramid, security and recognition, allows you to be legitimized, as it were. Now, that doesn't actually mean that ideology is irrelevant. So when we talk about the origins of the Cold War, ideology, of course, was highly relevant. But my approach to this is I would put it, I would assign a particular kind of role to ideology. For me, ideology had primarily a rationalizing role. It was important for rationalization, and it was also important for identification. Okay, let me break this down into two parts. So rationalization, what are we trying to rationalize here? By rationalization, I mean that you want to have some kind of set of ideas that would rationalize your place in the world and your role within this world. Yeah, so if you're claiming to be a global leader of some kind, you have to have supporting ideas, to explain why. It's not that just because you're such a very nice big country with lots of resources, will people follow you because you're just very strong or something? Maybe they will, but actually if you say, no, you have to follow me not because I'm strong, but because I'm proposing this great ideas that please all subscribe to these ideas, then you rationalize your leadership, you rationalize your position at the top of a particular hierarchy, particular political hierarchy. So this is a particular role of ideology. It serves for rationalization of political hierarchies. It also serves for identification. How do you know if you are, let's say, leader of the Soviet Union, you say Stalin? Oh, well, Stalin was actually, let's drop Stalin for a second. Let's say you're Brezhnev. You have lots of clients in the world to whom you provide weapons. How do you know that they are your clients and that they are reliable? It's like, when you go to a football game, two teams are playing, and you're supposed to put on the colors of the team that you support. If you've got reds and blues that are playing, you come there in green. This will create a lot of confusion because people will not know even where you're supposed to sit, right? As a fan, and what you're supposed to do. So ideology provided that kind of identification, that kind of colors and the shirt that you're supposed to wear. If you wanted to be identified with a particular superpower, you were expected to do certain things, and this is how they would know that you are on their side. I'll give you just a couple of examples from later in the Cold War, not from the origins of the Cold War, but my favorite examples come from Ethiopia and Somalia. In both cases, the Soviets really insisted on the creation of scientific Marxist-Leninist party. And they really tried to sell this idea both to the Somalians and to the Ethiopians, actually. And you would think, why did they even care about this? Yeah, in the end, there was very little Marxist-Leninist content to the supposed Marxist-Leninist parties. It didn't really matter, but the Soviets it mattered because it allowed them to identify those countries as their clients. The Soviets were thrilled when the Somalians requested their support in the establishment of a library which would have works of Lenin in there. Why? Because this shows that you're on our side. This shows that you identify yourself with the cause. Therefore, you are our true client. So ideology was very important, but mainly for rationalization and identification. It did not necessarily translate into particular policies, although sometimes it did. But whether it actually matters for the grand strategy of the Soviet Union is another question altogether. Whether the idea was there to have world revolution or something like that, I don't think this actually is helpful for understanding what the Soviets were doing at any particular time in their foreign policy. Okay, I've got a few more minutes and I will quickly just go over a couple of more things. The first is I wanted to talk about the role of the atomic bomb, because we cannot talk about the Cold War and the origins of the Cold War without talking about the atomic bomb. So when the Americans detonated their first atomic bomb, and then, of course, used it in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945, Stalin was impressed, but I wouldn't say that he was terrified of the bomb in terms of its destructive capacity. In fact, the Soviets sent a team to Japan to investigate and picked up some samples and concluded that the bomb was actually less destructive than they feared. But this does not mean that Stalin did not care about the bomb. Of course he did. And you can see from the speed with which the Soviets established their own atomic project, also, well, actually it was established before August 1945, but it was upgraded in August 1945 to become the #1 task for Soviet industry. If you look at this, you understand that Stalin gave a lot of attention to the bomb. Why? The reason is in the bomb's symbolic importance, because it was something that the United States had and something that the Soviets did not have. And so if you're talking about your recognition as a co-equal superpower, the question then becomes, how can you be recognized as such if you don't have something that the other superpower has? It's like you have a group of high school friends and one of them comes with a new iPhone. What's in the latest one? I think it's iPhone 13, or is it 14? I can't remember. And, you know, everybody's, oh, look at this. Oh my God, look at it. He's got a new iPhone and you don't have one. So, oh, well, I guess you're no longer the leader of that particular group. So that is kind of, you know, that's obviously a simplification. But for the Soviet Union, the atomic bomb was hugely important for reasons of their of being recognized as a great power by the international community, especially by the United States. And those hopes for recognition were suddenly dashed in August 1945. How did that impact Soviet foreign policy? Well, you can see that in the records of the London Conference of Foreign Ministers, which took place in September 1945 in London. This was probably the first real conference of foreign ministers that really got stuck. It just signaled that something was fundamentally, deeply wrong with this allied relationship. It was not going to last. And that became clearly evident in that conference of foreign ministers, which actually ended in complete failure. What happened there? The Soviets suddenly dug in on a number of particular issues. We don't need to go into great detail here. And the Americans and others were just so surprised, and they thought, you know, why is it that the Soviets are so stubborn? They're just not willing to compromise at all on any of those issues. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because we actually have now declassified record of Molotov's, Soviet foreign minister's, correspondence with Joseph Stalin, who remained in the Soviet Union. They corresponded by telegrams, and you can see Stalin directing this conference of foreign ministers, or rather the Soviet position at this conference, and reacting to various things that Molotov said. If you read those closely, you can see what really triggered Stalin. Stalin was upset when it transpired at the conference that when the Soviets took a particular position, the Americans would say, well, you know, this position is unreasonable. Look, everybody is against you. And indeed, the other participants, i.e. The British, the French, the Americans, and the Chinese, nationalist Chinese, would all generally take a position against the Soviet Union, putting them in a situation of being outnumbered 1-4. Isolated and outnumbered, and that really got on Stalin's nerves. He was really disturbed by this kind of situation where the Soviets had no one to, you know, they couldn't even play on the contradictions between the allies. They were completely outnumbered. And then there was something else that was interesting, and that is the US Secretary of State, James Burns, played the atomic card at one point, and it was not even an official session. It was just a kind of a joke. At one point, there was a discussion between him and Molotov, and Molotov said something like, what, you have an atomic bomb in your pocket? And James Burns said, well, you know, us Texans, we have atomic bomb on our hip, and if you don't cut all the stowing, I will pull it out and I'll let you have it. So that sort of thing, you know, this was clearly an example of early atomic blackmail, is what you would call it, created a kind of situation where the Soviet leaders felt that they have to dig in their heels, or they will give the wrong impression to the Americans. If they don't, you know, if they yield a little bit on just some minor issues, the Americans would then gain the impression that the Soviets were yielding under pressure, that they were afraid of atomic bomb, and they would make even harsher demands on the Soviet Union. So as Stalin cabled Molotov, the Allies are pressing you to break your will. You have to be absolutely resolute in pushing back against them, which is Molotov did. And of course, the conference fell apart. So Stalin's response to American atomic monopoly was to push back as much as he could and where he could, and that in many ways generated counter-reaction from the Americans, because they saw that as unwarranted aggression on the part of the Soviets. Therefore, you know, Cold War confrontation became almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. You couldn't get out of this mutual escalation on both sides. When both sides think that the other side only understands force, of course, you know, conflict is probably the only inevitable result of this. So the question is, was force the only language that the Soviet Union understood? If you read Kennan, his long telegram mentioned above, you will see that this is how Kennan approached this question. He thought that the Soviets were, as he put it in the long telegram, impervious to the logic of reason, but highly sensitive to the logic of force. Basically, force was the language they could understand, and so if you push back against them, they would usually retreat, which may or may not be true. Such a view sort of hinges on us perceiving the Soviets as fanatics driven by ideology in a very black and white understanding of the world, where you can just have conflict and war and any accommodation is temporary. And I think this kind of view simplifies the nature of both the Soviet Union and mentality of the Soviet leaders. Dumps down, as it were, their psychology. It does not allow us to account for how Stalin behaved in Europe and Asia, again, with regard to things as I said about his emphasis on legitimacy, and also his different approaches to different places in Europe and Asia, depending on their relative importance in his understanding. It does not explain why, let's say, Nikita Khrushchev in the late 1950s was so happy in reaching out to the United States and proclaiming the spirit of Camp David. It does not explain why Brezhnev so insisted on having Helsinki Agreement, which legitimized the Soviet position in Europe. Nor does it explain why Gorbachev, proclaimed adherence to universal human values. So this black and white understanding of Soviet leaders as fanatics, I think, obscures more than it illuminates. Now, another problem with this is that if we put so much emphasis on ideology and say, well, no, they were driven by Marxism-Leninism, we underplay continuities in between Soviet foreign policy and Russian foreign policy today. The question that I ask is, if Marxism-Leninism explained why the Soviets were so aggressive, then why is it that Russia is still on such bad terms with Europe, despite the fact that Marxism-Leninism has long been relegated to the ash heap of history? How do we explain this? What do we make of this? It doesn't make any sense. So, nor does it, I think it's actually important, this approach that I've just outlined, is actually important for understanding what is happening today in relations between China and the United States. What do the Chinese want? What they, what are the ideas that they're driven by here? I think the best way to understand that is to go back to the Maslow pyramid and see. Okay, I'll leave it here. Thank you very much for listening.